She killed herself.
That can't be. Why? It's my fault. I'm responsible.
You're damn right you are.
So I recently rewatched Cogenitor, and it is far worse than I ever remember it being. I have a few reasons in particular why I think this, but I'm going to get into those in a little bit. So to give you a brief rundown in case maybe you haven't seen it in a while, the Enterprise is observing a hypergiant. The bridge crew is trying to determine if they can move closer to observe it, and they discover another ship in the area that is able to get closer. The captain of the other ship introduces himself as Captain Drennick of the Vissians. The Vissian captain offers to help modify Enterprise's sensors to help measure the star's nucleosynthesis. And Captain Archer invites his people aboard. They, have dinner on the ship. The captain offers to take Archer on a research mission in one of their, what they call stratopods, which they can kind of take closer to the star. And that is kind of just an excuse for Archer and the other captain to just not be in the episode for the most part. They cut to them a few times, but for the most part, they're just not there. Archer is gone, and then Trip Tucker meets the Vissian's chief engineer and his wife Kala, and they are sitting at a table with a third person that they don't address. Trip introduces himself, and Kala is like, this person doesn't have a name. It is our cogenitor. Trip is kind of confused about that, and he's like, what do you mean by that? She's like, we're hoping to have a baby. She's like really excited, and he's just like, okay, whatever. So cut to him in sickbay talking to Phlox, and Phlox explains that not all species are limited to two sexes, and talks about how the cogenitor is part of their reproductive process. He tells Trip to keep an open mind. The chief engineer of the other ship explains to Trip that cogenitors are only needed for reproduction, and that when they're not needed, they're assigned to a different couple.
Is the one I met the only one on your ship?
The only one. Once Kala and I are finished with it, I doubt it'll be needed before we return home.
He seems confused when Trip expresses curiosity about the cogenitor and about, their education and whatnot. He wants to placate that interest, it seems. We get a scene, this is to show, how boring this fucking episode is. They feel the need to have two extra subplots. They show a plot with Archer explaining why he's away from the ship. He's like, I'm gonna take a 3-day mission with the other captain. We're gonna go in this stratopod and we're gonna observe the sun up close. And it's like, they have this incredible guest star, and this is all they're going to do with him. And it's just so, wild to me. And the other subplot that they have is Malcolm Reed. He sleeps with the tactical officer from the other ship. And there's a weird scene where she, feeds him cheeses in a really sensual manner. The other reason that they felt the need to show Archer's plot was to show him bonding with Drennick, the captain, and it shows not just their professional and kind of diplomatic relationship, but it shows that they have kind of started to form a friendship. And so it shows for some of his later decisions in the episode, it gives maybe a little bit of a reason for it. Trip talks to T'Pol about how the Vissians seem to treat the cogenitor, as he puts it, like a pet, or less than a pet even, because Archer's dog has a name, which I'm blanking on. T'Pol really brushes him off, and she says that he shouldn't judge other cultures, and Trip kind of comes at it from a humanitarian lens, which makes sense. She also mentions that Archer wants to maintain a good relationship with the Vissians, which I think is important to point out. Trip talks to Phlox and expresses similar concerns, and Phlox kind of also brushes him off and says that it's not their, right to judge. But yeah, Trip continues to wonder if it's right to treat the cogenitor in the way that they do, and he devises a plan to scan the cogenitor. He goes to the chief engineer, he gets invited to dinner, and he scans the cogenitor, and he gets proof that the cogenitor basically has the capacity to be as intelligent as the male and female of the species. He comes to the conclusion that, it's not really fair to treat a person in this way when they have the capacity to be more than that. And so he goes to the chief engineer's quarters when him and his wife aren't there, and he talks to the cogenitor. He offers to teach them how to read, and they object, but it honestly seems like it's more about sort of wanting to avoid punishment than it is a genuine disinterest.
Why are you doing this? It's not right for me to read.
Who told you that?
You shouldn't be here.
They are a minority, like, I think it's like 3% of the population, and they don't exactly have rights. Trip kind of points out that they are a crucial part of the process of making the child. Like, they sort of, the way that they explain it in the lore, I guess, is that the cogenitor provides some sort of enzyme, and when Phlox explained it to Trip was like, cuts him off, and he's like, I don't want to know about it. But basically, the cogenitor is an important part of the mating process. And suffice it to say, the cogenitor is interested in the idea of learning, but is afraid of the idea of their people not allowing them to do so. So the cogenitor decides that they want to be named after Trip. Trip is his nickname. His given name is Charles. And so the cogenitor decides that they want to be called Charles. So Trip and Charles go to Enterprise, and Charles worries that they're going to be punished for going to Enterprise. And Trip is like, well, maybe we should go back. And they're like, no, I want to see, the ship and experience life, basically. And Trip shows them engineering. They watch the day the Earth stood still. And, later Trip gets told by T'Pol that he isn't welcome on the Vissian ship anymore. And T'Pol kind of says, like, the cogenitor's education is not your concern, which I found really odd because, although Trip is, especially at first, being, I guess you could say, presumptuous, I think T'Pol is being a bit harsh here. She tells him that he may have ruined first contact with the Vissians, which is very well possibly true, especially considering that Charles comes to Trip and tells him that their people are angry with him and that Charles is not going to be allowed the freedoms that they are desperately longing for, which is pretty sad, honestly. And it's a cry for help, honestly, like, more than anything. And Trip takes it very seriously. It's arguable whether Archer takes it as seriously as he should have, but Archer kind of chews out Trip for what he did. Trip is like, I did exactly what you would have done. And Archer's like, that's not true. Even though, I think it kind of is true, but also, Archer, as you'll learn when you watch a lot of the show, Archer's character is wildly inconsistent a lot of the time. So it's, I don't know. It's hard to say whether he would have or not, but regardless, he makes the point that the cogenitor didn't ask Trip to teach them how to read, which I think is honestly kind of an unimportant distinction. And he tells Charles it's not their place to tell them what rights they have. Charles asks if Archer's going to make them leave. Archer meets with the captain, the chief engineer, and Kala, and basically tells them, I have to take this asylum request seriously. The chief engineer is like, Charles belongs on the ship. Archer leaves and thinks it over, and he decides against granting asylum, and then he talks to Drennick on the view screen afterwards, and Drennick is like, I hope yesterday's unfortunate incident won't interfere with future relations between our people. Archer responds by asking if he can spare a stratopod, which is an interesting way of kind of viewing where his head's at that point, I think. After Enterprise leaves the Hypergiant, Archer learns that the cogenitor has committed suicide, which, yeah, he calls Trip to his ready room. He tells him what happened and tells him that it's his fault. It's Trip's fault. And then he tells him that the chief engineer and his wife won't be able to have a baby because of it, which is pretty wild. And then he tells him that he hopes he learned a lesson and that he had no business interfering and a few other things that I'm not going to get to right at this moment, but it's pretty wild. It's a pretty shocking ending, and it feels really depressing, honestly. It's shocking for no reason, and it just feels like a letdown in a lot of ways. I don't want to go too deep into like the legal stuff surrounding non-interference, because I do think a lot of it it's a plot device. Although this episode does serve as first contact with the Vissians, the species is warp capable, and Enterprise's collaboration with them ruins any possible notion of neutrality. In essence, they're already involved, even though he chooses not to do anything. Essentially, what I'm saying is, thinking about this ethically and not legally for a second, you may not be morally obligated or even allowed to do something to change a society like this. But at the same time, the Federation might not want to get too deep into bed with them, especially considering how weird their mating rituals are. Phlox knows about that.
I have pictures.
I think I'll pass.
So this is from Star Trek Federation, the first 150 years. It's basically the text of General Order 1. Section 1 doesn't really apply because that's for basically a non-warp society. This is the part that really matters. It's, if engaged in diplomatic relations with said culture, you must stay within the confines of said culture's restrictions. Now, of course, the Prime Directive didn't exist at the time that Enterprise takes place, which is roughly 2151 to 2155. They didn't really have any strict laws about that, but let's say we replace that with any policy akin to non-interference, which I think, yeah, Trip interfered when he taught Charles how to read. Problem is, like, when you kind of look into that even a little bit, it didn't exactly take much convincing. Charles immediately takes to reading, and part of that is the fact that their species is shown earlier in the episode to learn things incredibly quickly, but also they wanted to experience things that they hadn't before. I don't think all of that can be reasonably attributed to, you know, learning from Trip. But regardless, they requested asylum. You know, it's a difficult position. I respect that. I'm not really interested in looking at the other times that Archer interfered on other cultures or anything like that, because I don't really want that to be the main focus of the video, but I kind of want to more look at the theming and morality. To me, what is at the heart of Cogenitor in theory is the struggle between respecting other cultures and the protection of autonomy. And I actually kind of have another episode in mind to look at from this perspective. An episode that has very similar theming to Cogenitor. It's a Season 1 episode from Deep Space Nine entitled Captive Pursuit. Season 1, Episode 5.
It's their custom, Chief. Under the Prime Directive, we have no right to interfere.
What if Tosk were to request asylum?
If he asks for it.
The wormhole opens up and a creature named Tosk comes through the station through the wormhole from the Gamma Quadrant, not knowing where he is or how he got there. Once there, Miles O'Brien takes an immediate liking to him, but after Tosk tries to override the weapons locker and gets put in the brig, another ship comes through the wormhole, breaks through Deep Space Nine's shield, and we learn that Tosk was the prey in a hunt. Basically, he was bred to be hunted. He trained all of his life for it. And since he was captured alive, he's to be taken back home and put on display as a failure for everybody to see for the rest of his life, which means he does not get to die with honor, as is basically his goal in life. Commander Sisko argues with the hunter and in the end admits that he can't judge their society, but that they can't conduct their hunt on the station in the future. O'Brien tries to convince Tosk to request asylum. Tosk refuses, saying it would be against everything he believes in, despite the humiliating fate he would otherwise endure.
I live to outwit the hunters for another day. To survive until I die with honor. But that will not be my fate.
It's honestly a super emotional and character-defining episode for O'Brien. So in the end, O'Brien interferes with Tosk's transfer, uses an airlock weapons scanner to knock his hunter out, and basically breaks Tosk out, brings him back to his ship so that he can resume his hunt. You know, the characters aren't given a lot of options. Tosk was raised for the hunt, and O'Brien hopes to give him asylum at first. He realizes the best option is to be free and live another day, be able to sort of run away. And then, as he puts it,
O'Brien. Die with honor, O'Brien.
Despite mentioning the Prime Directive at the beginning, Sisko is willing to allow asylum, but only if Tosk asks for it. That's important. He does not want to interfere with their hunt, but he's respectful of what the individual wishes to do. O'Brien does interfere with the hunt, but only because he realizes the fate Tosk is left with after being captured alive. And, you know, he realizes that that's a terrible alternative. When Sisko figures out what O'Brien is doing, he doesn't stop him. And he reprimands him at the end for disobeying the Prime Directive. But O'Brien asks how they were able to get off the station, and Sisko dodges the question. He's like, I don't know. I guess we missed that. I guess we didn't notice. So earlier I mentioned how asylum is brought up a lot in Star Trek, particularly in contrast to concepts like the Prime Directive and non-interference. And it's often kind of used as a plot device so that the individual can leave a society that they deem as unjust or that is actively oppressing them. There are a few other episodes I can think of that fit this theme, especially as it relates to autonomy. Masterpiece Society, Regine. Another great example of this is Voyager's Death Wish, in which Quinn, a member of the immortal Q Continuum, requests asylum on Voyager so as to become mortal because he has tired of the Q Continuum. And, Q Continuum is immortal. They have a lot of powers, if you've seen any Q episodes. Voyager ones, some of them are not very good, but this one is. And it's an autonomy, and it's a philosophical argument of, like, would you want to live forever? Would you want to, experience the infinite everything and then sit back and be like, okay, now what? And I think, it has an interesting ethical discussion. And in that, it also talks about the concept of non-interference, which I think in the Q Continuum is a little bit less of a concern because they are very powerful. Their concern was that if Quinn left and talked about wanting to be mortal, then the rest of the Continuum would also want to do that. But then it begs the question, if you're not allowing people to leave your society because you're worried other people will leave your society, what does that say about your society, right? I would say I have my issues with the Prime Directive as a whole. I do think broadly that, like, a non-interference policy is a good idea in theory, especially as a critique on things like, U.S. foreign policy. Like, a major galactic power certainly should not have the power to go into any planet or country, change things the way that they want, and then just leave. And that's, I think, part of why the Prime Directive existed in the first place as a response to things like, Cold War, Vietnam. But, I think there has to be some nuance in that discussion. The Federation places value on things like diversity and equality. And, if you're talking about a society that has a subjugated gender whose literal sole purpose is to provide an enzyme for childbearing, and not just that, but that they don't even get to see that child, they just get shuffled on to the next couple, and then they just spend all day in their quarters and don't get to do anything ever. Like, that's pretty fucked up. And it's not a question of how their mating practices work, it's a question of, like, autonomy. Like, people should be able to choose if they want to have children. I think that is pretty evident. But also just, like, not a particularly hot take. So in Captain Pursuit, the hunter specifically says that the Tosk are bred for the purpose of being hunted. This parallels the Cogenitor, as although they weren't specifically bred for what they do, they are treated as though it's their sole purpose.
It's not our place to judge the customs of other cultures.
We're not talking about taking your shoes off when you walk into someone's house. This Cogenitor is treated like one of Phlox's leeches. You pull it out of its tank when you need it, then you throw it back in.
Trigender reproduction is not uncommon.
That's not what I'm talking about. This is a question of human rights.
They're not human. Captain Archer hopes to develop a productive relationship with this species. It might be best if you kept your opinions to yourself.
I find it odd that they should simply ignore the morality to continue good diplomatic relationships and technology trading. We're talking about a net benefit, right? You can't, or rather you shouldn't, ignore human rights violations for the sake of personal gain, or not even just personal gain, but political gain. I think a situation where a character does what they think is right, helping someone who is a second-class citizen for characters that they can't change. He asks for the help of the captain. He doesn't give help. They commit suicide. And I'm not saying it was Archer's fault. I think it's a larger issue. It's a societal issue. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later when I get into the ending of the episode. But I think it's important to bring up that, like, you can't turn your back on the morality of something that a civilization does because you want something from them. I do want to bring up the ending conversation and how it puts the rest of the episode into perspective. But first, I want to do a brief gender diversion. So on a side note, I've been using they for Charles the Cogenitor because it is the most commonly used gender-neutral pronoun in English. The Vizians use it for the Cogenitor, and while I know that some trans people use it as a pronoun, the Vizians use it as a dehumanizing construct. Trip, Archer, Phlox, and T'Pol use she, despite the Cogenitor never mentioning wanting to be called she, and this is simply because Trip thinks that they look more like a her than a him. The episode is clearly a bit similar to TNG's The Outcast, in which Riker falls in love with Soren, an alien from an androgynous species known as the Janai, who essentially comes out as female. The episode has its issues, not gonna pretend that it doesn't, but it's full of commentary, particularly regarding the taboo nature of homosexuality in the 80s and 90s, and in retrospect, the episode episode can be read as an allegory for being trans. And honestly, the cogenitor can as well. I mean, we're talking about a third gender. And so, I think we have a better understanding nowadays of sexuality, sex, gender. And I think it's good that Star Trek has embraced that. There are canonically queer characters in pretty much all of the newer Star Trek shows. And I think that's a very good thing. So that's my gender diversion. So back to regularly scheduled video. The episode largely only allows Trip and Charles to voice the nuances that are inherent to Charles's situation. Archer, T'Pol, and Phlox, for the most part, only seem to see any discussion of their rights as not respecting the civilization, which I find really frustrating, honestly, because it's like they don't see this person as worthy of even having a conversation about, and that's pretty fucked up. Archer a little bit has a moment towards the end where he entertains the asylum request, and he kind of entertains Trip's point of view a little bit, where he's talking to the chief engineer and his wife and the captain. The chief engineer says, "Are you suggesting my wife and I abandon our plans to have a child?" And Kala talks about how long they've been waiting to be given a cogenitor, and Archer's like, "Given? You act as though you're talking about an object, not a person." And the chief engineer goes off about how what if one of your servant people asked to be granted asylum because they're forced to serve you? And even though Archer points out that they aren't forced to serve him, his retort is see, you don't really know anything about us. And it's I don't think that's true. Archer literally has one conversation with the cogenitor. He talks to Charles for 2 seconds, but he talks to the Vizians for it seems 5-10 minutes at least, and entertains their position. The other person who kind of entertains Trip a little bit is Phlox. He sees the scans and he admits that the cogenitor has the same level of intelligence, but that's pretty much it from Phlox. So anyway, Archer has that conversation with the Vizians, and he basically ends it after that weird input from the chief engineer, and he basically says "Oh, I'm not going to ignore someone who needs my help." And then straight from that, it goes to him making his decision. And it's clearly you are going to ignore someone who needs your help. But okay, whatever. Anyway. So I want to talk about the ending now, which is the big reason why I dislike this episode so much. Some of the rest of the episode is bad because it dismisses just the possibility of the cogenitor, having agency or even wanting to talk to the cogenitor. Trip is pretty much the only person to talk to the cogenitor for the entirety of the episode. And I think that's pretty fucked up. Even including crew members. I'm pretty sure that Archer is the only other person to talk to them. Archer calls Trip to his ready room. He tells him that Charles killed himself. At which point Trip is already ready to take the blame, and Archer angrily agrees with him. He is furious. He seems to consider the chief engineer and his wife not conceiving as almost a more important problem than the suicide that just happened. He tells Trip, maybe this will teach you a lesson, which is just so beyond fucked up. I don't even know where to start. He then goes on to say that Trip had no business interfering, which I touched on previously. But he talks about how he thought he was doing the right thing, but he wasn't. I haven't been very successful at getting through to you, and if I had gotten through to you, you would have thought a lot harder before doing what you did. And I don't even really know what he meant by that, to be honest. It sounds like he's like a concerned parent or something. It really doesn't make any sense to me. It sounds like a parent lecturing their kid about smoking weed. All that prompts Trip to say, "You're not responsible," which I thought was the most honestly heartbreaking part in that whole episode, because not only does Trip think that he's responsible, but he feels like he has to take the weight off of Archer's shoulders. And then Archer's okay, get the fuck out of here. He doesn't say that. He dismisses him, and that's it. It really feels like the episode wants to remind us of the consequences of Trip's actions rather than I don't know, Archer's inaction. And I'm not trying to say that Archer is directly responsible for the suicide, but again, it just seems like this missed the mark so hard. I'm not a mental health expert by any means, but the fact that Archer said that Charles committed suicide essentially because Trip taught them how to read is really something to think about, isn't it? They have seen that they can be more than they are, but they realize their people will never let them, and that their hope of asylum within Enterprise. Their hope of freedom was destroyed. They're never going to get that freedom. You know, their request was denied, and they were not treated like somebody worthy of autonomy or of agency in any way. Trip was a catalyst in their attitude changing about their people. I think that that's fair to say. But he obviously didn't cause them to commit suicide. I think that's a very stupid thing to say. And I think even entertaining that idea is a very, again, irresponsible and downright abhorrent thing for the writers to say. I don't want to come too hard on fucking Rick Berman over here, but I mean, come on. The idea that somebody could be responsible for someone else's suicide, aside from like if they were like an abuser or something, is a really, I feel like, a very harmful message to send to an audience. And it's terrible writing. Like, people whose lives are going well don't tend to kill themselves out of nowhere, and like there's no reason to blame Trip. And like beyond that, like, why include a shock value suicide? Like, it adds nothing to the episode. It doesn't make it more interesting at all. There's no reason for it. I know this is probably an obvious point to make, but I'm just saying. It's, I think, rare for me that the ending of an episode ruins it so completely like that. You can chalk it up to bad writing, and I do. Don't get me wrong. I do. But in most other episodes with ethical dilemmas like this, despite what the characters ended up actually doing, the writers usually ended up actually making you wrestle with those ethical dilemmas a little bit more, regardless of how you ended up actually feeling about the characters. Archer's reasoning is left pretty much completely ambiguous. They just kind of cut to it, and that's it. It's sort of like they put these ethical ideas on the table, and then they said, here you go, think about this, and we're not going to really do anything with it. Because most of the time when Trip talks to his crewmates about it, they brush him off and say he should just respect their culture. Not saying you shouldn't respect culture, but again, it's not something that really is relevant when you're talking about a person who should have agency. Star Trek has taught me that there's not necessarily one right way to handle an ethical quandary, which is why there's so many interesting episodes that deal with them. But this episode's definitely taught me that there can be wrong ways. Beyond that, I think that the narrative framing pertaining to these scenarios is incredibly important to how we view the characters and how we kind of contextualize the scenarios, whether or not we justify them. And this episode ignores a lot of serious mental health and autonomy considerations for the sake of shock and for the sake of kind of moral relativism, and it still didn't end up being an entertaining episode. It trivializes suicide and uses it as a plot device, and it holds a sympathetic character responsible for someone's mental health. That's just my 2 cents on this episode. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. And if you liked it, leave a like. That's it for now. Live long and prosper.